All right, great to see everybody this morning. Good crowd already for Bible study. I know we've got a few filtering in, taking food over to the new fellowship building. Let's be turning our Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. We're picking up where we left off in Hebrews chapter 11. And I said last week, I don't really want to rush through chapter 11. I'm enjoying the study. And we're really digging in and getting a lot out of it. And our goal originally was to kind of maybe spend about 2 weeks, and that's just been blown out of the water. So we spent all week last week on verse 7, just talking about Noah. Today we're going to talk about Abraham from verse 8 all the way to the end of verse 16, about his call and about Sarah, and then we have the heavenly hope in verses 13 through 16. So we'll make it down through verse 16 today. And next week, we'll cover a lot more of the chapter. Probably take us about another 2 weeks to get through. And I do want to spend some time in that last week on some of what's mentioned in the latter part of the chapter. There's a lot of generic references to people who are, they were tortured, killed by fire and sawn in half, and I want to talk about all that and save the last week for that. So what we'll do is next week we'll cover verse 17 down through about verse 29, and then spend the last week talking about the remaining verses, verse 30 down through verse 40, and talk about what that might have been, and do we have any historical evidences of what's talked about in this passage. And there are some, we'll talk about some that we know historically have been recorded that fit the bill in this. All right, so let's talk about chapter 11. We talked about what faith is. Chapter 11, verse 1 is not, it's not meant to be an exclusive, all-inclusive definition of faith, but it is a little bit of one about how faith drives us to believe in unseen things, not a blind faith, but based on evidence, and especially the promises of God. And that's really down through verse 6, where he finishes that whole section by saying, God is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him and who believe that God is capable of rewarding those who do that. And then we begin with the examples last week. Verse 7, we talked about the flood, had great discussion on that, about the pre-flood world, the no rain, the building of the ark, and everything involved in that, and how applicable his example is, Noah's example, to the readers, because there's a lot of similarity between their situation and Noah's. Different historical circumstances, but still in principle, very much the same. So let's begin today by reading, beginning in verse 8, down through verse 16, and then I want to go back and let's begin to discuss Abraham. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out of the place to which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he dwelt in a land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. By faith Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Now, before we start discussing, what do you get out of that, of what we just read? And there's sort of a common theme that's through verse 12, and that's certainly in verse 13 through verse 16. What do you get out of this for Abraham? Joel?
This is very applicable to the audience.
I think so. Yeah.
They did not receive, everything. God said, I'm going to give you this. Okay.
Okay.
He could see a vision.
Yeah.
So that goes back to verse 1, the things not seen.
Not seen. Yeah.
He didn't see it, but he fully believed in God. And he could have turned back. I think that's important.
Yes. He could have done it, but he did not do that, Ken.
It seems to me that God gave these people insights into heaven,
It sure sounds that way.
and therefore,
I would agree with that.
that's really what
Yeah.
drove those people of faith was to get there.
Yep. And however much or little they understood something about it. And I think we'll talk about that in just a moment. Do you think it's easy to, when we read the Bible, right, you see a guy like Abraham and he lived thousands of years ago, or even in the first century, you go back 2,000 years. Is it kind of easy to disconnect and think that their situations were totally sort of dissimilar to our own? And what they experienced is kind of not what we're experiencing. And for that reason, I think what Joel is saying is we don't tend to see those people and their lives as having application to us. And yet, if you study the life of Abraham, even though he might have lived a couple of thousand years prior to the lives of the people that are reading this letter and us today, are there still parallels between his situation and what they were going through? Yeah, Art? Absolutely. Yep. Right? Very similar situations, though, in principle. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Tom?
Times change,
Sure.
but people in situations do not change.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. So even though time changes and culture changes, are the real life problems that the people of God face, are they essentially the same, and have they always been the same? Right, so you might have different clothing and different culture, and it might be masked differently in a different setting historically, but the principle of what we face is still the same. Abraham faced situations that are very much like what these people are going through. So, a couple of things real quick, and then I want to start looking at how the writer now develops the concept of faith through Abraham. Here's the first thing. In the Jewish mind, right, so let's put ourselves in the shoes of the readers, because these we determined at the beginning of the book, this is a largely Jewish audience, probably where they're located, certainly in the way that they're described and the way they would think in this book. They're a largely Jewish audience. In the Jewish mind, you had superheroes, right? You had folks that stood out as being the bulwarks of your faith and history. And at the top of that list, who would you probably put at the top of the list? Abraham. Why would they put Abraham there? He's the father of the Jewish nation, right? So in their mind, Abraham was number one. Of course, you'd have Moses and maybe Elijah and a couple of folks after that. But in the Jewish mind, there was perhaps no one more significant than Abraham because he was the progenitor of the Jewish people. Now, hold your place. Let's go back to the book of Genesis. And we're going to do this just like we did with Noah. We're going to go back and sort of draw from history. But go back with me to Genesis chapter 13. Chapter 13. There were two specific promises that sort of concreted Abraham's place in the Jewish mind for all the generations that would follow after, because not only did God promise this, this is exactly what he did. He fulfilled this a little bit later on. So chapter 13, start with me in verse 12. Remember the story, Abraham and Lot? They both had amazing possessions. I mean, just an overwhelming amount of possessions. And they had a dispute over, and it wasn't maybe between the herdsmen, it was kind of a confrontational thing, but between Abraham and Lot, it wasn't a big deal. They just needed practically, logistically, to be in different spots so the herds would have a place to eat. And so they separate. Abraham goes his way, and so verse 12, Abraham dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, north, south, east, west, for all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever. And I'll make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. And of course, Abraham moved his tent and went and dwelt by the tamarind trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. Now that's the beginning of those promises. There's been a hint of it already in the early part of chapter 12, which you're going to see in just a second. But God said, your descendants are going to be innumerable, and this is the land that I'm giving to your descendants. And then if you go to chapter 15, Abraham makes a covenant. Remember, he takes the animals, he divides the birds, and they walk between it. That's the symbol of the binding of the covenant. You can read about that back in the early part of the chapter. But if you drop down with me in verse 15, now as for you, you'll go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age, but in the fourth generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. It came to pass, when the sun went down, it was dark, behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between those pieces. On the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I've given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and the Jebusites. That land's all yours. So between these two passages, forevermore after that, the Jews would always look back and say, Abraham is the number one guy because he's the progenitor of our peace. From him come the people, and to him was given the land, and so he was tops. It makes sense that the writer of Hebrews, if he's trying to encourage these people who are Jewish-thinking people to be faithful, would use Abraham as an example. The second thing is just what we talked about, that his goal in using Abraham is to show that even though he lived a long time ago, that their situation and his situation were not dissimilar. All that Abraham did was what makes him great in the eyes of the Lord. It's attributed to his faith in God, and if they respected Abraham, then they should follow his example of faith, and that's what he's doing in this section. Okay, so I'm going to put a Bible ribbon marker right here in Genesis, because we're coming back. Let's go back to Hebrews chapter 11. All right, so now he's going to make several almost bulleted points. It's like if they had PowerPoint back then, this would be his PowerPoint bullet points of the faith of Abraham. So his first point in verse 8 is what? What does faith do in response to God? He obeyed. That's what faith does. Faith obeys what God tells him to do. So by faith, Abraham obeyed. And that's what faith does. Whether we understand all of God's plans, whether we can see the end that God has set in motion for us, or whether we can foresee even the practical consequences of it, it doesn't matter. Because what does faith do? Even if it doesn't understand everything that God has in store, it still does what God says to do. That's what faith does. It responds with compliance to the conditions that are set forth by God. It doesn't argue with God. Faith doesn't look for another way around what God said. It just accepts that what God says is right. Now, in verse 8, when he said he obeyed when he got called to go out of the place where he would receive the inheritance, what's that a reference to? What historical event is that considering? All right, the call of Abraham to leave where he was, Ur of the Chaldees, and go to a different place. So go back with me to chapter 12 of Genesis. And I don't know sometimes that we give the due respect to that call that we need to, because it was, if we put ourselves in his shoes, I mean, it was a major upsetting of his entire life to do the will of God. So go back with me to chapter 12 of Genesis. Let's take a look together at chapter 12. All right, listen to verse 1. Now the Lord had said to Abram, all right, so if you go back, you get in chapter 11, you get Ur of the Chaldees, and you kind of get a sense of his family life and where he'd been. And we're going to look at some of that in just a second. Listen to what he says. First of all, chapter 12, verse 1, get out of your, where? Okay, you got to leave your country. You're going to follow me, you got to get out of your country. What's the second thing? You have to leave the family that you've got in that country. And then he says, more specifically, from your father's house, and then it says, to a land that I will show you. And that helps us, I think, a little bit to understand how major this decision was on the part of Abraham to do what God asked him to do. So leave your country, leave your family, leave your father's house. Now, let's provide some context for that, because this is not just simply saying, I live in Hickson, and I decided that we're going to move up to Soddy Daisy or Sail Creek or Bakewell, and you're making a change from just one location to about 20 miles up the road. That's not kind of call and change that Abraham was required to make. Go back with me to chapter 11. And what I want us to do is, as we read this, we're going to read two different passages, and you must make a conclusion based upon what the Bible tells us as to the kind of culture that he lived in and what kind of change he was required to make. So look at verse 27. This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begat Lot. So we know that Lot is Abraham's nephew. Haran died before his father Terah in his native land in Ur of the Chaldees. So we know the land that he lived in was called Ur of the Chaldees. Then Abram and Nahor took wives, and the name of Abram's wife was Sarah, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Ishkah. But Sarah was barren, she had no children. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, the son Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarah's his son Abram's wife. They went out with him from Ur of the Chaldees to go to the land of Canaan. They came to Haran and dwelt there. So the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now that's important because we learn about some of the family line, and the names are important because there's a commentary in the Bible later on what these people were involved in. So you can kind of remember what's said in Genesis 12. Go with me, turn your Bible to Joshua chapter 24. Joshua chapter 24. Joshua chapter 24. All right, remember those names, Terah, Abram. Remember those names? Look at chapter 24, look at verse 1. Now, you may remember this chapter. This is the great chapter in which that classic verse, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, right? Everybody knows that, verse 15. Look at verse 1. Then Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and called for the elder of Israel. This huge assembly is being called of all the people, for their heads, for their judges, for their officers, and they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said to all the people, Thus says the Lord God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah. Who is Terah? Abraham's dad. That's his father. The father of Abraham and the father of Nahor dwelt on the other side of the river in old times, and they, that's plural, they did what? They served other gods. Now, if you include Terah, well, he's certainly one, but they would also tell us who else was involved in that? Even Abram was involved in serving other gods. And so was Nahor. And so was Haran. And so verse 3, Then I took your father Abraham from the other side of the river, led him through all the land of Canaan, and multiplied his descendants and gave him Isaac. Drop down to verse 15. Here's the one that everybody remembers. If it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose you for yourselves this day whom you'll serve, whether the gods which your fathers served. Who would one of the fathers be? Abraham, which your father served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So Abraham simply didn't just pick up and move from one place to another place, and it was as simple as his life stayed exactly the same. He sold a house in Hickson and he moved to Soddy, but his life was unchanged. How catastrophic were the changes in his life? What's involved in the kind of change he's making? Okay, he's leaving one culture for another culture. Would that be a tough choice? Right? Because again, it's not like moving from one side of town to the other side of town, because if you move from Hickson to Soddy, well, there might be a slight cultural change, but there's not much of a cultural change. This would be like moving from Soddy Daisy to Africa. Would that be an upsetting cultural change? Would life be totally different in Africa or Russia or some other place of the world? And not only that, who did he leave behind? He left his family behind. And not only that, what also did he leave behind according to these verses? His religion, right? He was an idolater, and God said, you give all that up and follow me. And he did. Art? Yes, everything. All of it, everything. So it wasn't just leaving a small thing. He left what was familiar. He left what he had already experienced, what he knew in the past. He gave up what he felt was, we would all do it, what was secure, right? You have security in what's familiar. He gave up family. He had family there, and he had a social network in that place along with his religion. He gave all that up for the promises of God. Now, was that similar? Oh, yeah, Bobby, go ahead. I don't mean to cut you. Okay, that's exactly it. All the things he had to give up, in principle, was that what the readers of Hebrews were having to give up to? So this is a very similar situation. They were being asked to follow now what was unfamiliar versus what was familiar. They were being asked now to involve themselves in what they had never experienced before and gain a different society, gain a new family, new provisions, all under God. And so Abraham, pretty much like them, just in principle. Art? Yes.
He was wrong, but when he saw the truth, look how he changed. Abraham was exactly the same way.
Yes.
Look how he changed and look how important he was. Like Paul's important to us in the New Testament.
Yes.
Abraham was that important.
Very much so. Very much so. Tom?
Well, when you look at it today, people do the same thing today when they come to Christ, to the fact of having to leave stuff behind and even family, because there have been those who have come and obeyed the gospel and their families disown them for that.
Yeah.
And so, some things are different, but they're the same.
Yeah. In principle, it is the same, right? Only the names and faces change. So two very similar situations. And if Abraham was being asked to leave what was familiar and where he thought he had security and go and gain new relationships and everything, and he did all that by faith, what's the principle? What's he trying to tell the readers? What's going to be their success? Faith. And if Abraham can act in faith, and this is what he did, you can do exactly the same. All that was accessed and possible because of faith, because faith is obedient. That's his point in verse 8. Abraham obeyed, and you're being asked to do exactly the same thing. Tom?
Yes, he left a lot of stuff behind.
Sure.
But he was a very wealthy man.
He was.
And he had, I'm going to use the term baggage. He had a huge amount of baggage. Wouldn't be like you or me moving from Saudi Arabia to
Yeah.
some other place. It would be like moving a small town.
Yes.
A whole town from one place to another.
Yeah, it'd be like packing up the Biltmore and trying to find a place to go and handle all that. It would be like that because he had great possessions. Miss Jo?
When did it change? When did Abraham change?
You know, when you read chapter 12, it said the Lord had called him. So sometime between the ending of chapter 11 and the beginning of chapter 12, historically, somewhere Abraham had followed God in between that. And we don't know the time, the specific year, but sometime within that, the implication is when God called him, he did. It was like based on what he knew of God then, he changed. Joel?
You know, I sometimes think we've got to be a little careful. You know, the Ten Commandments changed everything. I am the God
Yeah.
who will have no other God before
Yeah.
you. Okay. When did that come about, that in the wilderness?
Yes, Mount Sinai.
Moses' father-in-law was a priest,
Yeah, Jethro.
kind of priest.
Yeah.
To who? You know, so the Ten Commandments changed a lot. So we don't really go back prior to the Ten Commandments. That obviously God spoke to Abraham, and Abraham obviously recognized, wait a minute, this is not my daddy talking, this is not
Yes.
somebody, I'm gonna listen.
Yeah. And I'm sure that was, we don't know specifically what happened, but he did speak to patriarchs directly back then, and it must have been quite a difference to go from a golden calf that they worshipped in Ur of the Chaldees to a voice that came from heaven. So there was some evidence that he didn't have. And by the way, there is a roaming exhibit. It goes from place to place, and it'll stay a while, that has unearthed treasures from Ur of the Chaldees. And I know for a long time it was in Knoxville at the Frank McClung Museum up in Knoxville on the UT campus. I got to see it a couple of times, and it will go from place to place. And if you ever get a chance to see it, if you're close to, go see it. And the one thing that will impress you is in almost every single display, there's an idol somewhere in it. It was a highly idolatrous society. their calves and images, and Abraham was involved in that, and he left all of that to follow God. So an amazing thing. So that's the first point. Faith obeys. Now here's his second point. Go back and look at verse 9. Verse 9. He's making a second point about faith now that he's calling the readers to admit. By faith he dwelt in the land of promises in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. Now, in principle, he's telling them that when faith is obedient, faith is also, number two, it's sacrificial. Sacrificial. Because the land of promise, even though it was the land that God promised him, in truth, what was it to him still? How did he treat it? As what kind of a country? A foreign country. Well, why would he do that? And this is where we're going to get to what Ken was talking about earlier. In some way, what had God communicated to him about his ultimate place of residence? What was the earth to Abraham? Temporary place. That somewhere Abraham was going beyond this earth. Now, what's interesting is in verse 9, he says, he dwelt in the land of promise in a foreign country, dwelling in tents. All right, that's important. And some versions say dwelling as a sojourner. A sojourner. So it meant he went from being a land-owning permanent resident of Ur to being a nomad, to living a nomadic life. Yeah, sure, he dwelled in tents. I mean, he had tents to dwell in. But in truth, if you go to Genesis chapter 27 or 23, verses 7 through 20, the only plot of land he actually owned was what in the land of Canaan? Yeah, the cave of Machpelah, where he actually buried Sarah, and eventually he would be laid to rest. It's the only piece of land he owned, and he never dwelled there. It's just a place where she was buried. So outside of that, he had no physical place that he owned on this earth. And the same was true of Isaac, and the same was also true of Jacob, because they would move from place to place. Art?
Yet, as he's looking for a city here, we have in Luke 16th chapter that final thing, Abraham in paradise.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah. And he has received that promise, and so that's exactly right. Yeah. Were these readers, all right, and it would be us too, were they in a similar place as Abraham? Because ultimately, what are we on this earth? We're just sojourners, and we can build a house, and you can think, well, I'll stay here the rest of my life. But it's not permanent, because we're not staying there. And Abraham lived from place to place until he finally made it home by faith, and that's what the readers are required to do too. Is it 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11? We are strangers and pilgrims on this earth. That's all we are. And that's why we sing songs, here we are but straying pilgrims, based on that passage. Or this world is not my home. We do that. And that's important because these readers we've talked about before were tending to look at things through the earthly or the temporal lens, right? The physical seat in Jerusalem, the people doing the service in Jerusalem. And now they're being asked to look beyond that to something that they cannot see. And they were taking things through the filter of the present, and they can't do that. Instead, we have to filter everything through the lens of eternity and look toward heaven. And that's what they needed to do. And so now he's telling them that phase number 2 is sacrificial. And then here comes the rest of it, number 3. Faith is patient. And that's what the rest of this passage is doing. Even the inclusion of Sarah in this passage is that faith is patient. So now he says, verse 10, he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Specifically, he's waiting for that city where the architect and the maker of it is God. Now, I know that there's been a lot of conjecture. Some commentators look at this and say what he was really waiting on was the city of Jerusalem, and he never really got to see the city of Jerusalem. I disagree, and here's why I disagree with that. When he says in verse 10 that he's waiting for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God, we have commentary on what that place is. The commentary is in verses 13 through 16. So listen to verses 13 through 16, and let's see what God is telling us about that city that Abraham waited for. These all died in faith, verse 13, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. So whatever they're looking for is with the acknowledgement that this earth is temporary and something better is coming for them. Then verse 14, those who say such things declare that they're seeking a homeland, and truly if they'd come to mind or called to mind the country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. Now they desire a better, that is, what kind? Heavenly. Is the Bible its own best commentary? So whatever he understood, and I think Ken's right, we don't know their level of understanding, but whatever he understood, what was he looking forward to while he lived as a nomad on this earth? He was waiting for heaven. That's what the Bible says. So I do not believe this is talking about Jerusalem. I think he's talking about heaven, and I think that was their expectation, that they were okay with living as a place, no permanent residence on this earth, because they knew something was coming. So very quickly, let's run through verses 13 through 16, the commentary there, and then come back and see how he finishes this point. Verse 13. When he says, not having received the promises, these all died in faith not having received the promises. What's his point there? They've never received the promises? Or where did they not realize the promises? Okay, while they were on earth, they did not have the realization of the things that God promised, because according to this, what was God promising them? Heaven, right? So they didn't have it while they were on earth, but they died in faith, knowing that would be the end of that. And Art just pointed out that now when we speak of paradise, the paradise of God, it's called Abraham's bosom. So now we know it's been realized. But it would be received at the end of their earthly sojourn. Then in verse 14, those who admit that they are pilgrims are deciding that there is a permanent residence somewhere, but not on the earth, not in this life. And he even proves that by saying, if it was all a matter of comfort for Abraham, right? If it was a matter of finding a permanent place to live, then where would he have gone back? Ur of the Chaldees. That's where he's from. That's where his family was from. And it would have been much more convenient if it was a matter of just finding permanent physical earthly residence to go back where he came from. But he didn't do that because he had the promise of God. So again, in verse 16, he talks about heaven, which means, again, whatever their level of understanding was, they believed in heaven. They believed in it. And they knew that it was the reward of the faithful. And listen to verse 6. Without faith, it's impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. All they needed was the promise of God that as long as you do what I tell you to do, something better is waiting for you. They didn't have to understand it all, but they did have to believe that God was capable of doing that. And when they lived in faith, what was their reward? Heaven. They got heaven as a result of that. And because they committed to him in faith, God was able to identify and did identify as their God. You'll notice the language change by the time you get to Exodus 3. Remember, Moses is having the conversation with God up on the mountain, and God says for the first time, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not ashamed to be called their God because they believed in him. And it was that expectation that allowed them to patiently endure with whatever was going on in this life with a challenge. Now, the specific challenge here in verse 11 and 12 was what specific challenge was sort of the major challenge of their life? Having an heir. And why were they having trouble with that? The Bible even uses the language in verse 11 of Sarah. She was past age. What does that mean exactly? Because she was old when she had Isaac. What does it mean the body's past age? Does the body reach a point when it sort of becomes incapable of reproduction because of age? It just limits the natural ability to do that. So if you go back, there was a controversy. Back in chapter 15 and 16, Sarah and Abraham both knew that they were without an heir. In fact, Abraham's like, is Ishmael going to, am I going to have an heir from somebody else? And God said, no, be patient. And then in the very next chapter, Sarah, because she's trying to preempt the promises of God, gave Hagar to Abraham, and he went into Hagar, and she had Ishmael, and God reminded him, this is not your heir. I told you that you're going to have a seed. And they did, chapter 18 And through chapter 21 is the beginning of that. And in fact, it's during that time in chapter 18 that God, and we believe 2 angels with him, come to the tent door of Abraham, and they're having a meal, and he says, you're still going to have a child, and Sarah's inside the tent, and she overhears them, and what does she do? She laughs. You know, I'm an old woman. I can't have a kid. And but it comes to pass in chapter 21, verses 1 through 7, with Abraham being about 100 years old, they give birth to Isaac, who is the one of promise. And so, in the end, they patiently endured because they knew that God was capable of fulfilling his promise of something better than this life. So this is a fantastic passage for these people because, in principle, they're dealing with the same thing. They're not being patient with the promises of God. They're trying to give up on God, and he's reminding them, be patient like Abraham, and you'll receive the promises. Any comments on this? All right. About a minute before we have time. I don't want to get into verse 17 yet. Go ahead and look at that, though, for next week. We'll finish up Abraham, and we'll get down to, about verse 29 or 30 next week. And probably my favorite story of Abraham, my favorite example that's used here, verse 17 through 19, is the effort of Abraham to kill his son Isaac on one of those mountains of Moriah, what we learn from that. And it has every bit to do with the readers and what they were experiencing too, about the degree to which they would go in faith to follow the promises of God. All right, let's put a peg in it here. We'll finish up Abraham and look at Moses next week and a few others, and then we'll get to that latter part of the week after. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.